prayer. The different prayers have been occurring in the service. But I feel like that wherever you are, that we can always have a need for prayer. There's always a time where we speak to God and wait to hear from God. There is the time where we're in desperate need and desperately need to hear from God, or just need the reassurance that God's already there. And so as we think about praying and come to that time of prayer, I'm just reminded as I look around that each person seated here has a different need for prayer each and every day. And some it could be a time of struggle. For some it could be that restoration is right around the corner. And I've seen several of our folks who I know have some upcoming things, some that have been through some things recently and are back with us this morning. And good to see you this morning, and glad that you're back here with us. And we need to continue to pray, not just for the individual things that we have, the aches and pains and the difficulty in heart, but also we need to be praying for our church. We need to pray in the life of our church that God will use us in a mighty way in our world and the community around us. Let us go now to the Lord in prayer. Father God, we thank you so much for the gift of your Son, Jesus Christ. We thank you that in all things we can trust you, that we can lean on you, we can look toward you. But Lord, even as we come and we share the things and desires that are on our hearts, Lord, may we come and just meditate in your word in prayer. May we take the opportunity to allow you to speak to us, that you would impress upon us the things that you need us to know about you, how you love us, how you're guiding us, how you want to direct us. And may we also pray together as a body of believers for one another, but for the lost world around us as well. For the world around us, and sometimes has need to be skeptical of churches. There's been people who've been deeply hurt in the name of Christ in ways that perhaps Jesus wouldn't be terribly pleased with. And so for a church today, we have to work extra hard to be the example of Christ to the world around us. And we can't do that until we know truly your heart. So we need to search your word and to meditate on it and ask you to open it to us. Ask you to guide us as a community of faith as we seek to reach the world around us. That even as you bring healing and restoration in our lives, that if we know it can be true for us, then it can certainly be true for those who don't yet know Christ. And it should compel us to share the good news of Christ with those who do not know him. Lord, each and every day we come to you. We lift up our hearts. We lift up our voices. And Lord, in that experience and in that place, we're seeking you for hope, for comfort, for peace, for guidance, and for direction. And Lord, we pray that you would help us to focus more intently on you day by day. For in you we find the presence of who you are. You're the wonderful counselor, mighty God, Prince of Peace. We could go on and describing your attributes, the things that so lovingly describe who you are, and we would still run short of words. Father, today, may we look toward you more and more as we seek your face. Give ear to my words, O Lord. Consider my meditation. Hearken unto the voice of my cry, my King and my God. For unto thee will I pray in the morning. O Lord, in the morning will I direct my prayer unto thee, and will look up. Amen. Today, we have a wonderful privilege to gather as God's people. We have a wonderful privilege to come to this table, and part of our sharing and looking today, and as I said to to Chris and Brian last week. They were ordained as our two of our newest deacons, father and son. And on the parking lot on the way out, we said, well, we hope we get it all straight. And I said, well, you ain't got to worry about anything. It's my first communion here, too. So we're in this together, brothers. But as we come to the table, it is a place where we come and we experience something in a different way. One of the things you'll find out about me is that I think this is central. There are two ordinances that are recognized in the Baptist church, and it's the Lord's Supper and baptism. One of them we have to wait for the Spirit to move. The other one, the presence of Christ already beckons us to this place. And so almost every time we have the opportunity, you'll hear my sermons directed toward that, because I believe it is so central to what we do. Now, you may never have heard of this story before, but it's a story about brokenness. It's a story about restoration. It's a story about human life. And it's about a young, well, I don't know how young he was, but he was probably younger than King David. But his name is Mephibosheth. Now, if you say that a few times very fast, you may kind of dampen the person's head in front of you. So, you may want to be careful how carried away you get there. I feel like I'm very live. Does it sound that way to you guys? And so a little background on Mephibosheth. Mephibosheth was one of the sons of Jonathan. Jonathan was Saul's son. Jonathan was David's super good friend, and they were pretty tight and were good friends, and had pledged to keep track of one another. And what happens is in one of the battles, and it kind of predates the story that we have here in Samuel, 2 Samuel 9. It's actually in 2 Samuel 4. And what happens is one of the battles, Jonathan and Saul die. One, upon hearing the other's death, took their own life. And this is what it says in 2 Samuel 4:4. I'll just read you this so you kind of know what the background is for what we're looking at today. It said, Jonathan, a son of Saul, had a son who was lame in both feet. He was 5 years old when the news about Saul and Jonathan came from Jezreel, from the battlefield. His nurse picked him up and fled, but as she hurried to leave, he fell and became crippled. And his name was Mephibosheth. So here in the hurriedness of this time of war, the king and the king's son are both dead, and word gets there that this next generation, who were some of them younger, Mephibosheth at the time was 5 years old, and so those who were taking care of them and nursing them and providing for them knew they needed to get out of town. They needed to get out of Dodge. And so in hurrying, she slips and drops him, and he becomes crippled in both feet because of that. Many years had passed and the wars had come, and we already knew that King David was promised to be the next king, but that changes a little bit when you look at the story of humankind. We look at succession coming through the lives of the different children and grandchildren and so forth. So in chapter 9 of 2 Samuel, beginning in verse 1, going through verse 13, David asked, is there anyone still left of the house of Saul whom I can show kindness for Jonathan's sake? We'll talk more about that in a minute. Now there was a servant of Saul's house named Ziba. They called him to appear before David. The king said to him, are you Ziba? Your servant, he replied. The king asked, is there no one still left in the house of Saul to whom I can show God's kindness? Ziba answered the king, there is still a son of Jonathan. He is crippled in both feet. Where is he? The king asked. Ziba answered, he is at the house of Machir, son of Ammiel, in Lodabar. So King David had him brought from Lodabar, from the house of Machir, son of Ammiel. And when Mephibosheth, son of Jonathan, son of Saul, came to David, he bowed down to pay him honor. And David said, Mephibosheth, your servant, he replied. Don't be afraid, David said to him, for I surely show you kindness for the sake of your father Jonathan, and I will restore to you all the land that belonged to your grandfather Saul, and you will always eat at my table. Mephibosheth bowed down and said, what is your servant that you should notice a dead dog like me? And then the king summoned Ziba, Saul's servant, and said to him, I've given your master's grandson everything that belonged to Saul and his family. You and your sons and servants are to farm the land for him, to bring in the crops, so that your master's grandson may be provided for. And Mephibosheth, grandson of your master, will always eat at my table. Now Ziba had 15 sons and 20 servants. Then Ziba said to the king, Your servant will do whatever the Lord my king commands his servant to do. So Mephibosheth ate at David's table like one of the king's sons. Mephibosheth had a young son named Micah, and all the members of Ziba's households were servants of Mephibosheth. And Mephibosheth lived in Jerusalem because he always ate at the king's table, and he was crippled in both feet. Anybody ever heard this story before? Quick poll. I see a hand, maybe two. Very interesting story we have here. It's very easy when you're reading along to kind of breeze through this and say, well, maybe there isn't a lot to take notice of, but let's take a moment and just process this together as we look at these things. What we have here is we have a guy who had been hurt, injured, crippled some years back, and now he was no longer living in the city. David remembers that he made a promise before God because of his friendship with Jonathan. He said that he would show kindness or loving kindness. There's a Hebrew word for that called hesed. It's God's kind of love. It's very different. It's this covenant binding type of love. It's kind of what you would equate in the New Testament to the Greek word agape. And so he wants to show God's love and kindness because of his special relationship he had with Jonathan. And he was trying to see if there's anyone left. You know, there began to be, shortly after the death of Jonathan and Saul, kind of power plays to see who was going to come in and what sons were left and who would try to take over. And some of the destruction came from within the household itself, as they were all vying to see who would possibly be the next king, even though God had already determined that it would be David. And so at this later time, as the country has settled, David remembers those promises and said, there's been so much destruction. Is there anybody left? Is there anyone left that I can show this hesed to for Jonathan's sake? And so what happens is they bring a servant of Saul in, and he's asked to appear. And then David asked him, are you Ziba? And he says, yes. And he asked, is there anyone left from Saul's house that I can show kindness? Now, to take the king at his word would have meant he wanted to show him kindness. But you could probably also understand how Ziba might be a little bit skeptical. Like, well, is he trying to eliminate the rest of this line? Could he be asking me and prepping me to try to give over this last son that perhaps the line can be ended for sure? We don't know. He says he's going to show kindness, and so Ziba just has to take him at his word and says, well, yes, there is one left. But he makes sure that David kind of realizes he's going to be no threat. But he's crippled in both feet. He's not a great warrior like you. He's got some bumps and bruises. Is there anybody that we don't know today, including ourselves, that aren't coming with some bumps and bruises? The king wanted to show kindness. Where is he? The king asked. Ziba answered that he is at the house of Machir, son of Amiel, in Lodebar. Why is that significant? In Hebrew, a lot of the names, not all, but a lot of the names that we have come to us and they actually have meanings. Several years back, you may have seen a movie, I think it had Kevin Costner, Dances with Wolves. Well, a lot of Hebrew names were that way. They were names that also had meanings. And so these things also had meanings. Mephibosheth, the name meant one who destroys shame or shame no more. So a person through his infirmities perhaps would have felt shame or could have felt shame, had such a powerful name. You look further down and Amiel means my kinsman is God. What a great name. Came from the town of Lodebar. Lo means no, and dabar or davar in Hebrew means word. It has no name. He was brought there from no man's land, a place with no name, a person who was written off as crippled, and by everybody else would have said there's no threat, we don't need to worry about him, and he's over here, and why should anybody show him honor, and what can he really do, and so he's brought from a place that doesn't have a name. It says from the house of the kinsman of God, that the person with no shame could be brought to a place where they could be restored. Mephibosheth walks in, and he bows down and pays David honor. David calls him by name. Mephibosheth responds, your servant. And then he's reassured, do not be afraid, for I will surely show you kindness, and I will restore to you all the land that belonged to your grandfather, and you will always eat at my table. I don't know how this works for everybody, but I know how it works for me. When I read this story, the things that leap off the page for me are tables. We can be at whatever place we are, and the King calls each one of us from where we are, whether we think we're in no man's land or this place or a place that doesn't have any name, or out of a place of little significance, or out of our hurt, or out of our struggles emotionally, or out of our struggles spiritually, or wherever that might be. And the King knows us by name and calls us by name and calls us to come into his house and to be in his presence so that he can show kindness and grace and mercy and restoration to us. And it's not a place where we can just sit back and say, well, that's all fine and well, but the King has called, and he had no choice but to come. And so Mephibosheth comes, and when the King calls, and he calls him by name, and he says, your servant. When the King calls us by name, do we recognize that he is our King and that we're his servants? And we show up there, but it's actually a reverse honor. Mephibosheth comes thinking he has to bow down and show honor and show homage to David. And David says, oh, no, you're mistaken. I'm here. I want you here so that I can honor you, so that I can bless you, so that I can restore you. And no matter where you find the broken places in your life, that you're going to be restored, because I'm going to make sure that you're at my house and you're taken care of from this point forward. A man who, through all the earthly struggles he had, people probably had shamed him most of his life. The irony probably was that his name meant the one who destroys shame, or shame no more. But through David's very act, he made that a fulfilling prophecy. He brings Mephibosheth into his home, into the palace, and says, you will dine at my table, and your name, Mephibosheth, shame no more. You won't have to worry about the shame you feel, because when I look at you, I don't see that. I see something different. I don't see your brokenness. I don't see these other things. I see you as one of my sons, and you will eat at my table for the rest of your life. You know, the funny thing about tables is you come to a table, you think about a big kingly table. A lot of these tables would have had these ornate things setting on them. They would have had these long table drapes. Have you ever sat down at a fancy table that had a big, long tablecloth on it? When you scoot up to the table, what gets hidden by the tablecloth? Your legs. You'll always eat at my table. And my table is important enough and significant enough that what happens at my table can cover anything that has gone on in your life, any wrong that you've had, any struggle that you've had, anything that you think you could have done that has separated you from me. I'm restoring you and placing you at my table, that whatever my table does covers anything and everything that you can do or have done. There's not a place of shame, but a place of restoration, of hope, of giftedness, of thankfulness for who we have, that our King has prepared a table for us, whether it's in the place of comfort or in the presence of mine enemies. God has prepared a table for those who he has called by name and asked us to come to that place, that the shame and burden and brokenness of our lives aren't trapped in this life and recognized forever, but yet we're restored to a different and hopeful place because of who Jesus Christ is and not because of who we are. Mephibosheth had no promises showing up there. He shows up and just says, you've called me and you got my name right, and you're right, and I'm your servant. And he bows down. He says, you're mistaken. I'm here because you're here because I want to bless you, not to persecute you, not to make fun of you, but I want to show loving kindness to you, hesed, this covenant love of God. And he brings him to where he is. As we look at our own lives, we have to say, has God called us by name? Some of you are here today and God has called you by name, but perhaps it feels like or here sounds like a distant echo. You need to know again that God hasn't quit calling you by name. He's waiting to make sure that you're at that table each and every time that table is set and prepared, for he's called you by name. We acknowledge that we're his servants, which is what Mephibosheth does. But he cautions us, don't be afraid, because he's here to show us kindness. Maybe you're here today and you've never had Jesus Christ be a part of your life. You've never had the King speak to you, call you by name, and say, you have a place at my table because I prepared it. And I offer it that it can cover all the things in your life. The promise is also for restoration. He summoned Ziba and asked Ziba to look after the affairs because he knew that it would be hard or impossible for a man to be given that much wealth and that much restoration back, crippled in both feet and not able to manage it. In their day, every so many years, they would have a Sabbath year. And then every 7 Sabbath years, they would have a year of Jubilee, where anything that had been sold or transferred in property would return back to the original family's owners out of the 12 tribes. And so, in its own way, David is kind of pronouncing a year of Jubilee upon Mephibosheth, even though it wasn't a year of Jubilee. He's restoring that. That's what shalom is about. It's not about peace. It's a Hebrew word that means peace, but it's about order and restoration and balance. And that's what he's trying to do, is to make things right and say, your family's been devastated. Through no fault of your own, you're not able to dine at the king's table. But while I'm king, I recognize that you were part of that great family, and I call you to sit at my table for the rest of your days. How about you? Do you realize that you have an invitation to the table of the king? And however God has called you, would you come to this place and recognize that this table has been prepared for you and for me? Some churches practice what they call closed communion, where they would say if you're not a member of that church that you can't partake in communion. For me personally, that doesn't work, because Christ prepared this table, and if you're one of his, there's not a way that I could ever keep anybody from coming to this table if you're in Christ. And so today, I would just ask that you would prayerfully consider, are you where you need to be with Christ? Have you heard him speaking to you, calling you by name? Maybe you've never heard that before. Today can be that day that you come to the table and experience Christ whole and new. Our hymn of invitation and commitment this morning is hymn 366, Let Us Break Bread Together.